Hello everyone. Welcome to yet another session of the NPTEL course entitled Postmodernism in Literature. In the previous session, we're taking a look at how postmodernism could be defined in continuation with modernism or even as a departure from the dominant modernist tendencies. So today, we also try to take a look at what exactly happened in the postmodern period. We did look at a range of definitions, a range of ways in which postmodernism could be differentiated from the aspects of modernism. But in today's session, we're also trying to take a look at what exactly happened, what were the implications of the postmodern moment in arts, literature, and in diverse fields of study. So the first and foremost one is that the disappearance of the comforting security that reason offered, particularly during the modernist period. If we look at the trajectory of the modernist period in terms of the chronological literary history, it comes in right after the Victorian period where there was a dominance of a lot of crisis, the crisis of faith, the tussle between faith and reason. And we also find that during the modernist period, there is a way in which modernists also try to find a certain kind of a security, a comforting security within the aspects of reason, within the aspects of rationality. We find a continuation of the Enlightenment mode also reaching its peak during the modernist period. We find they all trying to be more intellectual, and the pursuit of intellect is also seen as a certain kind of an anathema, a sort of a solution to all the problems of the early 20th century. But we do know that the project of modernity failed after a point, and the intellect or the reason or the aspects of enlightenment, they fail to provide any kind of security or any kind of comfort in the face of the war and also the aftermath of the war. And we also realize that, and following this, we also see that there's a way in which hierarchy and system completely breaks down in the postmodern period. Especially after the 50s and 60s, it's very difficult to talk about the privileging of a discipline, the privileging of an art form, the privileging of a genre, or even the privileging of any political system, so to speak. And herein we also see a rampant critique of all kinds of universalizing theories, and this also led to the crumbling of all the intellectual grounds and foundations, giving rise to a number of crises, a lot of problems within disciplinary spheres, within learning systems, within the lots of within the ideas of meaning making processes, etc. And this ideally should be perceived as a crisis. This should have been ideally a major problem of the postmodern period. But on the contrary, paradoxically, we find that this breaking down of systems, this breaking down of hierarchy, and this move away from the comforting security of reason does prove very liberating and empowering as well. In fact, we find that in that process of empowering and liberating within the fields of, within the gamut of different disciplinary fields of study, we find there is an emphasis on the value and significance of respecting difference and otherness. And this is what we get when hierarchy and particular rigid systems move away. We have a lot of empowerment, a lot of liberation of spaces, sites, and identities which were hitherto not been visible, not audible, or not given any space for articulation. And in Cornel West's words, we do see and the emergence of new cultural politics of difference in the postmodern period. And one of the most prominent examples would be the emergence of cultural studies, especially from the 1970s onwards. And this, as we know, is an emergence of counterdisciplinary domains with a deliberate lack of distinct methodology and a refusal to privilege certain disciplines or texts or sites over the others. And with the advent of cultural studies, we also are being introduced to new forms of analyzing texts and sites critically, and also able to understand that nothing can be privileged over anything else. And we also find a very deliberate foregrounding of a mandate to investigate broad areas rather than very narrowed sense of scholarship and understanding. And in the field of cultural studies, we also have a lot of space to experiment, to negotiate with alternate forms of knowledge, alternate forms of identity, of history, of privileging new kinds of histories, newer kinds of subject positions are being emerged, and there's a lot of challenges inherent in this methodology, but there's also a lot of power and a lot of liberation associated with it. And when we look at the cultural and intellectual trends of the postmodern period, we also now find that the implications were very, very evident in particular schools of thought and in particular art forms. Some of the things that would immediately come to our mind would be the theatre of the absurd, which became popular in the 1950s and 60s, the most prominent example being Waiting of Godot by Samuel Beckett. Waiting of Godot was a play which really talked about the postmodern condition, the absurdity of the postmodern condition, without necessarily lamenting the incoherence, but rather celebrating it in a very humorous way, in a very nonsensical way. And there was also the emergence of magic realism, which could be seen as perhaps the most defining aspect of the postmodern narration, the postmodern novel. The seminal architects of this being Marquez, Salman Rushdie, Gunter Grass, etc. And we also have the entire generation being named as the beat generation, and the kind of poetry that they generate being known as the beat poetry. We also have the significant poetical rendition Howl happening in the 1960s, which also challenged the entire idea of culture, poetry, and finer aspects related to all these renditions. And looking at these various developments which could be labeled as postmodernists, we do see that these are all the implications, these are all the advantages of having reached the postmodern age, the after modern age, where one did not have one no longer had to be concerned about the form, about the symbols, and about the intellectual meanings of various related things, as the modernists were very predominantly concerned about. And in terms of theoretical frameworks, we do find that the theories and aspects of post-structuralism and deconstructions have close contiguities with postmodernism. And in a number of works where we try to understand the element of postmodernism, and we try to theorize postmodernism, and we try to provide convenient frameworks to access postmodernism, we find a continuous discussion, an overlapping discussion of post-structuralism and deconstruction. So in that sense, when we try to frame postmodernism as a theoretical, as a conceptual principle, as a dominant cultural tendency, we will be very generously using the writings of Foucault, Barthes, Derrida, Baudrillard, Deleuze, Lyotard, and Kristeva. Our discussions will not be limited to just these texts and authors, but we should also be looking at a range of similar works which were also produced during this similar historical period. And here, how do we make use of these different theories? Foucault, as we know, was the one who spoke extensively about discourse, and Barthes and Derrida had a lot of discussions related to language and semiotic systems. And we also have Baudrillard talking about simulation and hyperreality. In fact, when we talk about hyperreality, maybe one of the immediate examples that would come to our mind would be the contemporary movie Inception, where there is a representation of hyperreality through the form of a visual media. And Deleuze spoke about rhizomatic systems of knowledge, where one cannot privilege one form of knowledge or one form of knowing or any form of dissemination over the other. And Lyotard, as we know, he was someone who also tried to define the postmodern condition, and he spoke about aesthetics and politics in connection with the idea of postmodernity. And in Kristeva, we also have a number of discussions related to feminism and abjection. So following these texts and writers, we should also try to build up a framework within which we can access different forms of postmodernisms. And the other critical paradigms which would also be useful and which would be convenient to locate, critique, and to engage with the ideas of postmodernism would be primarily Marxism. And we also have a couple of critics and writers such as Frederick Jameson and Terry Eagleton accessing postmodernism and trying to critique it within the framework of Marxist theoretical principles. And Kwame Anthony Appiah is one writer who challenges the idea of postmodernism through the lens and framework of postcolonialism. And we have Patricia Wu talking about the need for different feminisms within the postmodern world, and also the absence of certain kinds of gender-related issues within these articulations of postmodernism. There are also other feminist writers who have also put forward this idea that perhaps postmodernism is a very male forte, because just when the women writers had begun to articulate themselves, just when the women writers had begun to claim subjectivity for themselves and for their works and for their sites and for their texts, the male writers have decided to entirely forgo of the idea of subjectivity, the idea of identity, and also move on to a very post-modern phase. So there are these different challenges within which postmodernism needs to be understood and situated as well. And we also have some writers such as Sarah Abstone and Len Platt talking about race and African American writings within a post-modern framework. And all of these aspects, from Marxism, postcolonialism, feminisms, and race and Afro-American writings, we understand that there is no single way of understanding postmodernism, but perhaps only postmodernisms. And what is important for us to remember is the possibility of different figurations of postmodernism. It could be French, Canadian, white American, African American. The difference could be based on race, gender, the location, the region, the nationality, the ethnic identities. And unless we take into account the possibility of these different figurations and accommodate these different tendencies, these different aspects of postmodernism, we would not be doing justice to this very hybrid, to this very unconventional and very non-linear phenomenon known as postmodernism. So in this course, though we are trying to frame postmodernism in a very modernist sense within particular schemes, within particular systems of thought, and within particular critical frameworks, we also try to ensure that there are no overriding principles about postmodernism which are being privileged over the other, that we take into account all forms of available scholarship, all forms of available critiques, endorsements, and all kinds of approaches with respect to postmodernism. So we continue to emphasize the idea that cultural values are local and particular, and they are not universal and eternal. There is no linear progressive trajectory. So for this course also, even when we are trying to trace the genealogy of postmodernism, even when we are trying to delineate a particular trajectory, we also acknowledge that it would be difficult to construct a linear progressive intellectual trajectory. And we also work with this inherent assumption that the idea of postmodernism, the studies on postmodernism, all kinds of discourses and discussions and negotiations within the framework of postmodernism will always be embedded within debates, irregularities, controversies, provocations, and contestations. And in fact, we shall be working with all these challenges and within these ambiguities and along with these ambiguities in order to define postmodernism through perhaps particular works. So this focus on particular works becomes very important because it also gives a structure to our thought and also enhances our scholarly understanding about what has been written about postmodernism, related to postmodernism, what were the theories and the theorists used to talk about postmodernism, and why has postmodernism been defined in the way or has not been defined in the way it is seen today. So in that sense, we shall be primarily looking at Lyotard's text and Frederick Jameson's writings, Baudrillard, Gilles Deleuze, John Barth, Linda Hutcheon, and Brian McHale. Though these texts cannot be seen as works per se to define postmodernism, we find that these are mostly commentaries, and it's very useful to understand the notion of postmodernism. And we also will be taking a look at a few helpful texts by Roland Barthes, Michel Foucault, and Jacques Derrida. Though these authors, these theorists and philosophers have not directly attempted to define or theorize postmodern, we find that they talk about the ways in which the text, the author, and the language have changed, have moved away, or perhaps even the idea of the text, the author, and the language have entirely disappeared in the postmodern age in some form or the other. So a close reading of some of these works would also help us to form our own opinion, our own critical judgment about whether postmodernism is or was, or whether postmodernism is yet to be, or whether postmodernism is not there at all, whether this is an extension of modernism or a complete rejection of modernism. So these are close reading. Perhaps my hope is that you would be able to make your own critical evaluation and judgment about the phenomenon of postmodernism. I also try to wind up today's lecture by referring to a particular work by John McGowan. He had published a book in 1991 about postmodernism and its critics. So it's also useful for us to remember that postmodernism is not a movement, not an intellectual paradigm accepted by one and all. It also has its share of critics, and there are also a number of critics who even argue that the postmodern phase is not there at all, that we only have an extension of the modernist period. So having said that, John McGowan in his book has identified 4 different distinguishable camps to talk about the theories related to postmodernism. First of all, he talks about post-structuralism, and among the post-structuralists we primarily have Derrida and Foucault. Then he talks about the literary left, that being the second camp, where he talks about the works by Jameson and Terry Eagleton. He identifies the third camp as being neo-pragmatism, where he chooses to discuss the works by Lyotard and Rorty. And fourthly, he talks about feminism, rather feminisms. But however, he does not choose to delve deeper into it because he thinks it's also a part of the neo-pragmatic approach towards postmodernism. And in that sense, when he talks about Derrida and Foucault, Jameson and Eagleton, and Lyotard and Rorty, we get a sense of how in different camps postmodernism operates. We need not necessarily buy John McGowan's arguments or his postulates about the existence of these 4 different camps, but nevertheless it's an interesting way to look at the different ways in which postmodernism has been framed. And in connection with this discussion, McGowan also talks about the precursors of the postmodern moment, and he identifies particularly Kant, Hegel, Marx and Nietzsche. And in the context of this, it's also important to recognize that the way McGowan presents postmodernism, he even identifies the precursors to a much earlier period, the Romantic period. And he says that it's only a way in which all of these things get, and he argues that all the postmodern items, all the postmodern and modernist trends could be seen as being foreshadowed from the Romantic period onwards. So he dates back the precursors to the 19th century in support of his argument. Moving on, even as part of this course, we shall be very briefly taking a look at some of the precursors of the postmodern moment, beginning from Laurence Sterne's Tristram Shandy, published as a range of texts from 1759 till 67, Immanuel Kant, Friedrich Hegel, Soren Kierkegaard, Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, Martin Heidegger and Jacques Lacan. We may not be going into the details of the works of these particular theorists and writers, but we shall be looking at how their thought process, how their intellectual trajectories were also contributing directly to the figuration of the post-modern in the contemporary, in the post-1960s. So as we wind up, we also take a brief look at Charles Jencks' ideas about the origins of the term. This is very useful for us to construct a genealogy of the term postmodernism. According to Charles Jencks is also someone who had written extensively about postmodernism in a very lucid way, which was also quite friendly to the layman. So Charles Jenks, writing about the origins of the term, he tries to trace a genealogy from the 1870s onwards, and he says there are instances of the term being cited, though in various contexts in the 1870s and much before the 1926, and there is also a particular reference that he talks about which came out in 1970. And 1960s, he continues to argue that this is the time of the posties. There is a lot of discussion about post-Christianity, post-religion, post-industrialization, and those were not always seen in a positive light. It was also about initially it was also about the breakdown of structures, systems, and a lot of negative aspects related to it. But in according to that, by the 1970s, we also have a sort of a foregrounding of a deconstructive POMO, and keeping in tune with the various ways in which many dominant ideas and ideologies of the previous decades were entirely getting deconstructed. But with the 80s, Jenks argues that we also reach a more constructive, ecological, and grounded and restructured postmodernism, and which also continues to become the most dominant form of articulation of postmodernism. And today, when we look back, Jenks argues that the postmodern condition, reactionary postmodernism, and consumer postmodernism, they all dominate almost simultaneously, and following which we also have the coexistence of these varied aspects, these varied items such as the information age, the Pope, and the Madonna. So we also see that it's in fact a coexistence of multiple things. There is a mixing of genres happening. There are the aspects of hybridity that we can see. So this work by Jenks, that we shall come back to a little later, is a useful framework for us to look at the genealogy of postmodernism. To sum up this lecture, a quote by Charles Jenks would be very appropriate and useful. He writes, "One of the great strengths of the word and the concept, and why it will be around for another 100 years, is that it is carefully suggestive about our having gone beyond the worldview of modernism, which is clearly inadequate without specifying where we are going. That is why most people will spontaneously use it." So Jenks talks about the ambiguities within which the term is placed, and it is within these ambiguities and uncertainties that we would also continue to operate and make sense of the idea of postmodernism and the aspects and the manifestations and the various forms of representations in literature. So thank you for listening, and we look forward to seeing you in the next session.